All right, today we're going to dive into one of the biggest, most ambitious ideas the European Union has ever had. We're talking about a giant marketplace that affects, hundreds of millions of people every single day. It's called the single market, and figuring out how it really works, well, that reveals the true power of the EU.
I mean, have you ever really stopped to think about it? How on earth do goods flow so freely across 27 different countries, each one with its own history, its own rules, its own traditions? It just works. It feels totally seamless. But behind that curtain, there's this incredibly powerful legal engine making it all happen. And the answer is the internal market. This was the big dream right from the EU treaties. The goal was to create this huge, single territory without internal frontiers. A place where goods, people, services, and capital could all move around like it was just one country.
Okay, so how do you actually make a marketplace that massive a reality? Well, it all starts with one simple, but honestly revolutionary rule.
Here it is, Article 34 of the EU Treaty. And the language here is just so direct. It says you can't have quantitative restrictions, and this is the really important part, measures having equivalent effect. It sounds totally absolute, doesn't it? No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So that first part, that's pretty easy to get your head around. A quantitative restriction is just a straight-up limit. It's like a country saying, sorry, you can only import 10,000 tons of Italian tomatoes this year. The EU just says, nope, can't do that. But that second part, measures having equivalent effect, oh boy, that's where the real story begins. You see, that one little phrase, measures having equivalent effect, it basically created this huge legal puzzle. What does it actually mean? The answer wasn't spelled out in the treaty. Instead, it came to life through a series of, honestly, pretty dramatic court cases that would go on to define the entire market. And it all kicked off with a case called Dassenville. So here's the deal. Belgian law required a special certificate of origin for Scotch whiskey. Now, if you were importing it straight from the UK, that was easy to get. But if you were trying to import it from, say, France, it was practically impossible. So the question was, is that an illegal barrier to trade? And the court's answer was an absolute bombshell. They came up with this incredibly broad definition. Just look at these words. All trading rules, capable of hindering, directly or indirectly, actually or potentially. Whoa. All of a sudden, almost any national rule that could possibly, even maybe, affect imports was on the chopping block. This was huge. So the next big plot twist involved a very popular French blackcurrant liqueur. You've probably heard of it, Cassis de Dijon. And this story is just a fantastic example of how tricky applying this big, broad rule could be in the real world. And this just lays out the problem perfectly. See, Germany had a rule, and they said it was for public health reasons, that said liqueurs had to be at least 25% alcohol. But Cassis de Dijon, it's only about 15–20%. So even though it was perfectly legal, perfectly safe in France, it was straight up banned in Germany. Now, this wasn't a quota, but it was definitely messing with trade. The court's ruling here was a game changer. What they essentially said was, look, if a product is good enough for French consumers, it should be good enough for German consumers, unless Germany has a really, really good reason to block it. And this gave birth to the famous principle of mutual recognition, which is, to this day, a cornerstone of the single market. But, maybe the pendulum had swung a little too far. Businesses started challenging all sorts of laws, like rules about when stores could be open on Sundays, arguing that they potentially hindered trade. The court realized it needed to dial things back a bit, and that's exactly what it did in the Keck case. The court came up with this really clever distinction. It said, okay, there's a difference between rules about the product itself, its size, its ingredients, what's on the label, and rules about selling arrangements. Selling arrangements are just about how you sell things, store hours, advertising rules, that sort of stuff. And the court said, as long as those rules apply to everybody, domestic and imported goods alike, they're generally okay. So this no barriers rule is obviously massive, but it's not absolute. The EU treaties always knew that sometimes countries have legitimate, perfectly good reasons to restrict trade. Think of these as the official exceptions to the rule. And those reasons are all laid out right here in Article 36. And they cover the big stuff, right? Public morality, national security, and this is the one Germany tried to use in the Cassis de Dijon case, the protection of public health. But, and this is a huge but, there's a catch. A country can't just yell public health as an excuse to protect its own local companies from competition. The court is going to look very, very closely to make sure the excuse is genuine and not just a sneaky way to protect their own market.
So, all of this brings us to the final and most crucial question of all. How does this whole system strike a balance between the dream of a barrier-free market and a country's very real right to protect its own citizens? And the answer is a legal test, a kind of balancing act called the principle of proportionality. The court basically asks two simple questions. Is this rule actually necessary? And is there a less disruptive, less trade restrictive way to achieve the very same goal? I love this analogy because it puts it perfectly. The EU is basically asking, are you using a sledgehammer to crack a tiny nut here? So if a country wants to make sure fruit is safe, does it need to ban all imports? Or could it just, I don't know, require a simple health label? The rule has to be the right tool for the job, not a sledgehammer that just smashes trade for no good reason. And this flowchart, this is pretty much the secret cheat sheet the courts use every time. Let's just walk through it real quick. You start with a rule that restricts trade. First question. Is it obviously discriminatory against imports? If yes, the country has to justify it using one of those strict Article 36 excuses, and it has to pass that proportionality test. If it's not obviously discriminatory, you then ask, is it a rule about the product itself, like in the CAS's case, or is it just a selling arrangement, like in KEC? Each path leads to a different kind of justification test. It's this logical, step-by-step process that keeps the entire EU's single market in balance. Because in the end, the single market isn't about making every country identical. It's a constant negotiation, this dynamic, delicate legal dance between total economic freedom on one side and the unique values and protections that make each nation what it is on the other. It's an incredible puzzle that's never quite finished, and it's really what makes the EU so fascinating. Thanks so much for watching.